We'll be taking a look at the different types of ammo inside of War Thunder. When you first start playing the game, it can be very overwhelming because there are so many different ammo types. But today, I'm going to break it down for you and show you almost every type of ammo that is in the game and explain what they all do. To start, there are two main categories of ammo. Kinetic energy rounds, such as armor-piercing shells, which use speed and hard metal to punch through armor. And then there's also heat shells, or high-explosive anti-tank shells, which are chemical munitions, which use a chemical reaction to push superheated plasma through tank armor. Of course, there's also high explosive shells, which explode on impact. And so every shell in the game can be categorized as either kinetic energy penetrator or chemical energy weapon. The advantages to kinetic energy is they can go through obstacles because they don't explode on impact, so you can shoot them through fences or trees. However, they do lose penetration over distance because they rely on speed. Chemical energy, however, cannot go through fences or trees because as soon as it comes in contact with anything, it will explode. It is also easily defeated by spaced armor. Again, the spaced armor will cause the round to explode prematurely. However, its main advantage is it does not lose penetration over distance, and because of the explosion it causes, it can often overpressure the crew and take sometimes a single hit from a well-placed high explosive round can destroy an entire tank crew versus an armor-piercing round which may punch a hole through but won't do as much internal damage. These shells in the game. So, to start, we're going to take a look at these shrapnel shells. They're basically just hollow armor-piercing shells filled with a bunch of tiny steel ball bearings. They're commonly used on early World War II era Soviet tanks. They don't have a lot of penetration, but as you can see from the animation below, they do deal a significant amount of post-penetration damage. They're mainly good for They're mainly good for use against lightly armored tanks and SPAAs. As you can see here, if you can penetrate, they do a significant amount of damage because of all the tiny steel balls that are inside of them. But I only really recommend carrying a few of them, again, because they have such low armor penetration values. Now, one of the most effective kinetic energy round at low tiers are going to be APHE rounds. Those rounds are basically, in simple terms, they're high explosive, or they're armor-piercing shells filled with a high explosive filler. And so when they penetrate the armor, they explode after penetration. And so with one shot, you can basically wipe out an entire tank. The only downside to these shells is against super lightly armored vehicles, they can often penetrate through both sides of the armor, so they go in and out without ever exploding. And when that happens, it's basically just like a solid metal projectile going through, and so it does significantly less damage. So you want to use these against mid and heavy armored tanks to make sure you give them a chance to detonate and deal max damage. Anyway, moving on. Shot AP shells. So basically what these are armor-piercing shells with nothing special about them. No explosive filler, no tiny metal BBs. Basically, they're just a solid metal bullet that pierces the armor and deals balling damage, but that's about it. So these shells are good against heavy armored tanks. They're commonly used by British vehicles. Britain is the nation that uses most of the solid shot AP shells. They're not super effective because they do so little damage after penetration, but again, they're pretty good against heavy tanks. But as you can see, the shell just kind of blows through and keeps going, doing minimal damage, especially if you don't have a well-placed shot. So with these shells, it's important to aim for critical areas of the tank. But again, if you can't penetrate a tank with anything else at low and mid tiers, these solid shot AP shells are usually pretty effective. And as you can see, there's obviously going to be a bunch of different variations of these shells, some with more armor penetration values than the others, but they all still do very little post-penetration damage. Shells in the game are these ones, the APDS shells. So that stands for Armor Piercing Discarding Sabot. And as you can see from the little animation below, it's basically a very small, fast-moving armor-piercing shell with a stabilizing plastic or metal sabot around it. So the projectile, it's what's known as a subcaliber projectile. The bullet itself is smaller than the significantly smaller than the barrel of the tank gun, and so that's why it has the stabilizing sabot. And by doing this, it allows the shell to move much faster, giving it better armor penetration values. The downside to these shells is because they are so small and light, they are relatively ineffective at long distances because they lose most of their power. They also don't do a lot of post-penetration damage because the penetrator core is so small. As you can see, they have no problem blowing through armor, but again, they do very little spalling damage. One of my most hated shells, APCR, which stands for Armor Piercing Composite Rigid. Basically, this is a very tiny shell with a tungsten core, shaped kind of like an arrow point, or like a little spear. It's very fast traveling. It has very high shell velocity, but the projectile is tiny. So when you penetrate enemy armor, it will do very little damage on the other side. It also, because it is so small, it can't really handle any sloped armor. So these shells only really work at close distance against super flat armor. But these are really good for if you're facing a super heavy tank, especially like a German super heavy tank, and the armor is flat. Like the front of a Tiger II turret is fairly flat. These would be good in that situation. But against sloped armor, they lose a lot of their penetration, and over distance, they lose a lot of their penetration. So really only save these for point-blank shots against heavily armored flat surfaces. As you can see here, despite having very good armor penetration, you're not really going to pen any seriously sloped armor. You kind of need to go for thinner sloped armor or flatter armor. But when you do pen, again, they don't do a lot of damage because they're so small, or the shell is so small, especially the penetrating core. But if you can't pen with anything else, and you're shooting flat armor, these can be relatively effective. Alright, so this is the last kinetic energy round we're going to be looking at. And of course, there are sub-variants of all these rounds. There's different versions, different nations have their own versions, there's different letters that mean the same thing, and there's a lot more complicated stuff I could go into, but to keep it simple, these are like the main different classes of rounds. Of course there's going to be different subclasses too, but we're not going to go into that right now. So the last shell is APFSDS, which stands for Armor Piercing Fin Stabilized Discarbing Sabot, and these shells are only used by relatively modern tanks. You won't find these in early vehicles. And so they work similar to APDS, as in it's a small sub-caliber sabot with a sabot around it, right? So they have incredibly high shell velocity, incredibly high penetration, and unlike the APDS shells, these shells do a significant amount of post-penetration damage because the more modern materials they're made out of. They're also longer, so again, they have more material blowing through the armor. And then again, these are also fin stabilized, which gives them better accuracy and better handling at longer distance. And these work perfectly fine against flat armor and spaced armor. So when you're playing main battle tanks at higher and top tiers, these are the main type of shells you'll probably be using. And they're effective against basically everything. They're effective against other main battle tanks. As you can see, they do a good amount of damage. They're also effective against lightly armored vehicles. They're really the best universal shell at top tier, especially because they're so fast. They allow you to really snap a shot off against your opponents before they can shoot you back. So at top tier, nothing beats APFSDS shells. These shells inside War Thunder. The main one is HE, or high explosive. And as the name would suggest, it's basically just a shell filled with high explosive filler. The larger the shell and the more explosive filler it has, the more effective it is. Almost every tank in the game has a high explosive shell. The smaller caliber ones are usually only good against like open top vehicles because they're going to overpressure the crew, or super lightly armored SPAAs. They can also be good for destroying obstacles, but the smaller caliber ones usually aren't effective against enemy tanks. However, different artillery pieces in the game, like the Swedish tank destroyer here, carry large caliber guns that really only shoot high explosive shells, and these shells are so large that the explosive force, even if it's not going to penetrate, just the explosive force from the impact takes out the crew. And so these shells can be very fun to use. They're hard to aim because they have such slow shell velocity and they drop off quickly, but they can be very fun and very effective as long as you're using large caliber ones. There are a few different variations of high explosive shells in the game, one being HETF, which is a high explosive shell with a time fuse, and as the name would suggest, you can set a time fuse on the shell to set it to explode at a certain time or distance, and these are mainly only used against aircraft like helicopters. As you can see here in the first animation, they're really good against aircraft, so that's basically their main use. They're kind of interesting. I don't use them much, but they do have a purpose. Now let's take a look at HESH shells. HESH shells stand for High Explosive Squash Head, and they're mainly used by British vehicles. And so how they work, as you can see in the animation here, is when you hit an enemy tank, the shells flatten against the surface of the enemy armor, spreading out a plastic explosive layer. Then the explosives detonate, which causes spalling on the inside of the armor. So the shell itself does not actually penetrate enemy tank armor, but the explosive force causes spalling on the inside of the tank. However, these shells are completely useless against base armor or composite armor, because if there's any gaps or layers of armor between where the shell hits and where the crew compartment is, it will just absorb the spalling. These shells are relatively fun, especially the larger caliber ones, because of the explosive force, like HE shells, you can overpressure the crew. And as you can see, they do a pretty good amount of post-penetration damage. It's just you have to be careful where you aim with them, because again, any spaced armor they won't penetrate, and they don't work super well against super thick armor, but they're kind of fun to experiment with and play with. Now we're going to take a look at HEAT shells. HEAT stands for High Explosive Anti-Tank, and how they work is, again, they have explosives inside them, and as you can see from the animation, they shoot a molten jet of metal basically through the tank armor. And so these shells do a significant amount of post-penetration damage, especially larger caliber ones, which can overpressure tank crews or open-top vehicles because of the amount of explosives in them. So as you can see, not only do they have high penetration values, but they do a lot of damage. However, heat shells can be easily countered by spaced armor. They also are ineffective if there's any obstacles between you and your target. They also can be easily stopped by explosive reactive armor, which is specifically designed to stop heat shells. You will find on more modern tanks are heat fists or high explosive anti-tank fin stabilized. And so these shells have higher velocities usually, and they're more accurate over long distances. And so basically they're just a heat shell, basically a more accurate heat shell used by modern tanks. As you can see here, they perform basically the same and deal damage basically the same as well as standard heat shells. They're just a little bit more effective, especially at range. The last type of shell we're going to be looking at today are ATGMs, which stands for Anti-Tank Guided Missile. And as the name would suggest, they are guided by, you can guide them to the target, right? They're guided by the player. And then they can be fired from different platforms. They're very commonly fired from top-tier Russian and Chinese vehicles. They're not commonly used on Western tanks. And their advantages are they generally have high armor penetration values. They also do a significant amount of post-penetration damage. And they can be very fun to use because guiding a missile and blowing up an enemy tank can be quite enjoyable. However, their downsides are they have very slow shell velocity. And so if you and your opponent see each other at the same time and you launch an ATGM, but they shoot an APFSGS shell at you, you will be dead long before your missile ever reaches your opponent. And again, they can't be fired through any sort of obstacle. And another problem is because you have to guide them, you can't just shoot and move on. You have to keep your tank still, or you can fire them. Some you can fire on the move, but you still have to keep your sight lined up on what you want to hit, which makes them a little more complicated. But they can be fun. This is a tandem charge one, which means it's been specifically made to counter ERA, or explosive reactive armor. It works it's the same basic principle as a standard anti-tank guided missile, except it has a small pre-explosive charge, which, as you can see here, destroys the ERA so that the main charge can go into the tank body. So even though there's explosive reactive armor on the front of this Russian tank, which is designed specifically to counter chemical shells, including ATGMs, because this is a tandem charge one with two separate explosives, you can see it'll blow right through that. So you can see the first charge goes off, neutralizes the reactive armor, and then the second charge punches through the composite armor and into the crew compartment. And so, again, standard ATGMs perform the same, they just don't have the small first charge, so they will be stopped often by ERA armor. But yeah, so those are all the main different shell types in War Thunder. I hope you enjoyed.